My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. The shrill vibration shattered the quiet kitchen where my father and I sat in the pale blue light before sunrise. A half-finished mug of coffee warmed my hands. Across from me, Dad calmly folded the morning newspaper, his reading glasses resting low on his nose. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I answered without thinking. "Sis, Dad passed away last night," my sister said. Her voice wasn't trembling with grief. It was flat, practiced, almost bored. Before I could respond, she continued. "He left everything to me and my husband. You're getting absolutely nothing." A low laugh slipped through the speaker. "My brother-in-law. At last," he said. "You're out of the picture." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Not because I believed them, because I was staring directly at the man they claimed was dead. Dad quietly lifted his coffee, taking another slow sip as though he'd just overheard strangers discussing the weather instead of his own funeral. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply pressed the speaker button. The tiny click echoed louder than either of their voices. Silence flooded the room. I watched my father's eyes narrow, not with anger, but with disappointment so deep it seemed to age him in seconds. The smug confidence on the other end dissolved into nervous breathing. Then Dad leaned toward my phone, his coffee cup still in one hand. With the calm voice that had settled every family storm for 40 years, he said, "Good morning. Since I'm apparently dead, would one of you mind explaining how you're already spending my estate?" People always assumed I was the difficult child because I asked questions instead of staying quiet. My sister Claire mastered the art of saying exactly what everyone wanted to hear. And my father spent years believing her kindness was genuine. I never competed with her charm. I simply learned to let actions speak when words were cheap. After our mother died, I became the one who drove Dad to doctor's appointments, fixed the leaking roof, balanced his bills when his eyesight worsened, and sat beside him through long evenings when loneliness echoed louder than the television. Claire visited just often enough to take photographs, post them online with sentimental captions, and disappear before dinner was served. Her husband, Mark, treated every family gathering like a business meeting, always steering conversations toward Dad's house, his savings, or what would happen one day. Dad noticed more than either of them realized. He rarely interrupted their performance, choosing instead to observe in silence. That was one lesson I inherited from him. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe no one is paying attention. I never cared about inheritance. I cared that my father was treated like a man, not a prize waiting to be claimed. Yet to Claire and Mark, I was an inconvenience, the daughter who lived nearby who knew every document, every medication, every habit. They smiled to my face while quietly pushing me aside, convinced I was too gentle to fight back. They mistook patience for weakness. That morning, as my father calmly held his coffee and listened to the stunned silence on the phone, I realized they had underestimated both of us for the very last time. Looking back, the phone call wasn't where the betrayal began. It was simply the first time Claire and Mark forgot to hide it. For months, their disrespect arrived in quiet, forgettable moments that only became meaningful when placed side by side. Claire would arrive at Dad's house carrying expensive pastries, kiss his cheek, then glance at me as though I were hired help. While I cleared the dishes or sorted his medications, she wandered through the rooms with slow, curious eyes, pausing a second too long beside the study where he kept his files. Mark was even subtler. Whenever Dad stepped outside to water the garden, Mark lowered his voice just enough for it to sound confidential. "You really shouldn't wear yourself out," he'd tell me with a polite smile. "Once everything's settled, you'll finally have time for yourself." Everything. He never said after your father is gone. He didn't have to. At family dinners, Claire interrupted whenever Dad thanked me for fixing something around the house. She redirected every conversation toward future renovations, property values, or neighborhoods where homes were selling fast. Dad rarely responded. Instead, he watched them over the rim of his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. I caught those glances. So did he. Neither of us challenged them. Silence has a peculiar way of making impatient people reveal more than they intend. Every careless pause, Every lingering look toward the filing cabinet, every rehearsed compliment became another thread in a pattern they believed no one else could see. By the time that impossible phone call arrived at 5:30 that morning, the trap hadn't been set in a single night. It had been building quietly for months. Dad let the silence stretch for several seconds after his question. On the other end of the line, I heard hurried whispers, a muffled gasp, then the unmistakable click of someone covering the phone. They weren't grieving. They were scrambling. He ended the call without another word. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the kitchen was the slow ticking of the wall clock and the soft clink of his coffee cup, meeting its saucer. Finally, Dad looked at me. "I hoped I was wrong," he said quietly. "Now I know." That sentence carried more weight than any angry outburst could have. He wasn't surprised they wanted his money. He was heartbroken that they had been willing to invent his death to claim it. Then he stood, walked to the study, and unlocked the small oak cabinet where he kept his legal papers. He placed a folder on the table between us. "I updated my will 6 months ago," he said. "My attorney suggested we wait before making any changes public." Inside were copies of every document, along with dated notes describing Claire and Mark's increasingly suspicious behavior. Dad hadn't been ignoring the warning signs. He had been quietly documenting them. In that moment, I realized revenge didn't have to be loud, cruel, or impulsive. The truth was already on our side. All we had to do was let the people who lied about a man's death explain themselves while he was still very much alive. That would hurt far more than any argument ever could. Dad had spent 40 years running a small accounting firm before retiring. Numbers never lied to him, and neither did paperwork. He believed every important decision should leave a paper trail, especially when family emotions threatened to cloud judgment. That morning, he treated the situation no differently than he would have treated a financial audit. His attorney opened the office early after hearing a brief summary of the phone call. Instead of discussing revenge, they discussed evidence. The speakerphone conversation had been recorded automatically. Through my phone's call log, Dad's handwritten notes were dated and organized. Copies of his updated will, trust documents, and medical records confirmed he was mentally competent and very much alive. No one suggested confronting Claire or Mark. The attorney advised us to remain completely silent. Over the next week, Dad answered their text messages with polite excuses whenever they asked to visit. They assumed their lie had frightened me into disappearing, just as they had planned. Their confidence grew with every unanswered question, and confidence has a way of making careless people reckless. Meanwhile, Dad scheduled a routine family meeting under the harmless pretense of reviewing emergency contacts and estate paperwork. Claire agreed immediately, even offering to bring champagne to celebrate getting everything organized. Mark volunteered to handle the documents, sounding almost eager. Dad smiled after ending the call. "They're expecting an inheritance," he said, carefully placing the recorded conversation onto a flash drive. "What they'll receive instead is an opportunity to explain themselves in front of witnesses." For the first time since the phone rang at 5:30 that morning, I felt completely at peace. We weren't building a trap. We were simply inviting them to walk into the one they had already built themselves. The family meeting began exactly on time. Claire arrived carrying a bottle of champagne wrapped in gold paper, smiling as though she were attending a celebration instead of discussing our father's future. Mark followed with a leather portfolio tucked neatly under his arm, already acting like a man preparing to manage someone else's estate. Dad welcomed them inside with the same calm politeness he always had. Nothing in his expression hinted at what was coming. Our attorney sat quietly at the dining table, introduced only as an old friend helping organize paperwork. Claire barely acknowledged him. Her attention kept drifting toward the folder resting in front of Dad. When everyone was seated, Dad folded his hands. "Before we review anything," he said evenly, "I'd like to play a recording." I pressed a single button. The room filled with Claire's unmistakable voice. "Dad passed away last night." Then came Mark's laugh. "At last, you're out of the picture." Neither of them moved. Their confident smiles dissolved before the recording had even finished. Claire's face drained of color, while Mark stared at the tabletop as though the wood grain might offer an escape. Dad let the silence settle over the room. Finally, he spoke. "I've spent my life believing character is revealed when people think no one is watching. You believed I was gone, so you showed me exactly who you are." No one argued. No one denied the voices on the recording. Our attorney quietly slid a single document across the table, a formal amendment removing them from every position of trust, authority, and inheritance they had expected to receive. Claire reached for the paper with trembling hands. Dad stood, opened the front door, and said only 4 words. "I wish you well." Nothing more was needed. Their own voices had delivered the verdict long before we ever did. News travels quickly in families, but the truth travels farther when it carries proof. Within days, relatives who had quietly assumed I had been excluded from Dad's life began calling, not to gossip, but to apologize. They had heard only fragments of Claire and Mark's version of events. The recording, shared privately with the people who needed to hear it, filled in every missing piece without a single accusation from me. Claire tried to explain that it had all been a misunderstanding. Mark insisted it had been a terrible joke. But jokes don't begin with a fake death, and misunderstandings don't end with plans to divide an inheritance before sunrise. The more they tried to soften their words, the more unbelievable they sounded. Dad never argued with them publicly. He simply refused to rewrite history to make them more comfortable. Their greatest loss wasn't the inheritance. It was credibility. Family invitations became less frequent. Friends who had admired their polished image began keeping their distance. People looked at them differently, not because we humiliated them, but because their own choices had stripped away the mask they had worked so hard to maintain. As for me, I realized something I had overlooked for years. Being underestimated had never diminished my worth. It had simply given dishonest people enough confidence to reveal themselves. Patience, honesty, and quiet observation had accomplished what anger never could. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't taking something away from those who wronged you. It's allowing the truth to arrive without raising your voice. Knowing that once people reveal who they are, no explanation can restore the trust they willingly destroyed. That's why this story matters. Not because of the money, but because character is always the real inheritance, and once it's spent, no fortune can buy it back. Months later, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed about the walls, the furniture, or the quiet garden outside Dad's window. It felt different because the tension that had lived there for so long was finally gone. Dad and I returned to the simple routines we had always enjoyed. Morning coffee, long conversations, evening walks where we discussed everything except money and betrayal. The inheritance that Claire and Mark had chased became meaningless compared to the peace we had regained. Dad never became bitter. That surprised me most. After everything they had done, he still chose kindness, not because they deserved it, but because he refused to let their choices change who he was. I spent too many years building a life to spend my remaining ones fighting people who tried to take from it. He told me one afternoon while we sat beneath the old oak tree in his backyard. I finally understood. The victory was never watching Claire and Mark lose what they wanted. The victory was realizing I didn't need their approval anymore. For years, I had been the daughter they overlooked, the one they assumed would quietly step aside. But being underestimated had given me something valuable. The ability to see clearly while others were distracted by greed. Life moved forward. Dad remained surrounded by people who loved him for who he was, not what he owned. I carried the lesson with me into every relationship that followed. Because the greatest revenge isn't making someone regret underestimating you. It's becoming so at peace with yourself that their opinion no longer matters.